everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for our second Presilium virtual coffee event. We're thrilled to be here with all of you this morning. Whenever we have the opportunity, we love to step back from the financial markets and numbers to enjoy an hour with all of you while we all learn something new. Before we get started, we wanted to give you 3 important updates as we continue to stay active for you at Presilium. First, rebalancing your accounts continues to work incredibly well. Over the last 2 years, we have had tremendous opportunities that we continue to take advantage of for you. Second, it is not too late to sign up for our virtual chocolate tasting event on October 19th. We are going to explore 8 different types of chocolate from all over the world, and it's going to be amazing. We'll send you an invitation right after this event. And finally, we want to extend a huge thank you to all of you who have introduced us to your family, friends, and colleagues. We have met so many wonderful people over the past year who are now receiving a much better financial planning experience because of that and your vote of confidence in us. Now, enough for me. I'll now turn it over to Conrad, our coffee connoisseur, who's going to guide us through an amazing experience this morning. Please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A section on your Zoom screen or email them to us during the presentation. Conrad, please take it away.
So, thank you, man. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm sure everyone's eager to dive into probably their second cup of coffee, if we're being honest. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump in and get started here. So if you guys could, go ahead and grab a couple of your favorite coffee mugs. Also, if you can get your water started to get boiled, that would be awesome. Whether that's, if you have access to a kettle, go ahead and get that started. That'll take a few minutes to hit the boiling point. We're actually going for about 206 degrees Fahrenheit. If you don't have a measure of the temperature, it's totally fine. It'll just be, once it hits the boiling point, just waiting for about a minute there. All right, so just to review, make sure we all got the same materials here. You guys should have received your 3 bags of Yield coffee, yellow, purple, and kind of like a pinkish. So kind of going from light to dark roast, just so that we get that full experience of, you know, all the different types of coffee. You guys should have received your Chemex kit with this reusable filter. Kind of cool. Typically, you guys might be used to seeing like a paper filter that goes over the top of Chemex, which are great and they work awesome, but there's typically just one dripping point. Whereas with this one, there's a lot of filtration holes around the outside, if you notice. So there's more, basically just the cup gets made much quicker, and there's more access to the grounds to be filtered at a higher point than just the bottom, right? And it's very easy to reuse. You can just toss it over the trash can, rewash it, make your next cup. So it's awesome from that regard. You guys should have got your tablespoon measure and your mug. So I think we have everything ready here. So we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm gonna get my water started here. And we're gonna start with the light roast. We're gonna go light to dark here. So if you can grab your Ethiopia bag and open that. Notice as you crack open this bag, the aromas will just start to fill the room. I'm sure they did once you open the packaging. So once you have the bag cracked open here, I'm gonna recommend to do anywhere between 2 to 4 scoops of the coffee in a tablespoon measure, right? So you're going to place that into this filter that's over top the Chemex, all right? So I'm going to stick to 3, but anywhere between 2 and 4 is great. And my scoops aren't perfect. So really it's probably like a 3.5 type of thing for me, but I just like to, you know, trick myself and say that it's 4. Or say that it's 3 rather. All right, once the grounds are in there, you'll notice that we kind of have this uneven mound, right? So to even it out, just go ahead and tap it a couple times on the side. You'll notice how that just flattens out the grounds like that. And then what we're going to do is either with the back of your tablespoon measure or with just your finger. I just like to use my finger because it's easier. To the first crease there of your index, just go ahead and make a little divot, just like that. And it should be able to mold pretty easily. All right. So why are we making this? So you guys remember the filtration holes on the filter are all around the outside, right? So if we were to just, typically people will pour around the edges, but if we were to do that, we would miss a lot of the grounds. The water would just come out of these sides, right? Where with the Chemex, the main benefit behind it is that we can control where the water is being poured. So because we created this little divot here in the middle, we're going to pour the water into that. And then what it does is it actually brings all the grounds up to the top and lets them filter through very nice and evenly. So that's kind of the reasoning behind that. But while the water is still heating up here, I figured I'd touch on, what is a light roast? It's a medium roast. What's a dark roast? We hear these things, we kind of just see them, on the menus, but we don't really know what they mean. We just kind of, oh yeah, sure. A lot of people go for dark roast because it sounds stronger or like extra dark, right? But there's different flavor components that come with each type of roast. And light roasts aren't typically a roast that are available in most of the coffee shops that you go to, like the Starbucks and the Dunkins, just because they require a higher quality bean. And so they're not as efficient for mass production. So light roasts tend to be more fruity and acidic. And they can get pretty fruity. So to give you an idea, if you look at your bag here, it'll list the flavors: floral, cane sugar, and bright citrus. They sound kind of like light flavors, right? So I grabbed another bag from Ethiopia, or an Ethiopian blend as well. You guys didn't get this one, but it helps to really wrap your mind around how fruity a light roast can get. So the flavors in this one, get ready: raspberry, lemonade, and blueberries. It sounds like a fruit smoothie from like a Jamba Juice or something, right? It's kind of weird to, put the two together with coffee. It's not something that we see typically, right? But light roast can really get fruity. So, but if you go ahead and grab your Mexico bag, the pink one, this is more on the darker side, just to show you how it shifts in flavor as we get darker. The flavors in this one are hazelnut, brown sugar, and milk chocolate, right? So more of like a, Thanksgiving, Christmas, kind of like a seasonal type of flavor. So how I look at it is like light roast is like fruit smoothies, and then dark roast is like the holiday type of time, those kinds of flavors, right? Cinnamon is oftentimes in there too. And then your medium roast, the Honduras, the purple bag, just kind of combines the two, right? So you have chocolate, vanilla, and orange, right? You got the orange from the light roast, and you got the chocolate from the dark roast, just kind of combines the two. So really cool from that perspective to just see all the flavors that are possible with coffee, and people get pretty creative with that. So in terms of a light roast, they tend to be more acidic. So people that might have acid reflux or something like that, I would say to avoid lighter roasts, because it just is much more like prominent as you sip it. You'll notice it in the first sip. But if you are one of those people, I would say go ahead and try the Honduras first in that case. The medium roast. Dark roasts kind of, for the most part, don't have as much of that acidity. So that would be a good one to stick to if you're one of those people. But I think my water is ready here. So I'm ready to pour this first cup. So we're going to pour it in a specific way. Okay. So as I mentioned, we're going to be pouring into the hole that we created, that little divot first. And as soon as that water creeps out of that hole, we're going to go around the outside until the water hits this top silver rim, and then we'll let the water filter down. Then we're going to do another round of pouring that's going to be a little bit different, but I'll show you guys how to do this. So this is a gooseneck kettle. Basically, why does it look this way? Just because it allows for a slow and controlled pour. So you'll notice I can be very strategic with where I angle the water. So as soon as your water creeps out of that hole, just like it did for me right there, you start doing some circles around the outside. until the water hits the top silver rim, and you let it just filter through like that. You can see how much quicker this is filtering than like the paper filter ones that you might see at, you know, some of your coffee shops, where it's like it can be like watching paint dry. You know, it's just like little tiny drips at a time, where this is pretty quick. So kind of cool there. But as this is filtering, I figured I'd, you know, touch on what is, like, why are we using this Chemex? Like, what's so cool about this? What's the difference between this and, you know, a Keurig, for example, that I'm sure a lot of you guys use, or an espresso, right? So the Chemex is a preferred brewing method in the coffee community, just because you really have control of where the water is going. As simple as that sounds, and, you know, basic. Typically, most coffee machines, you'll have your, you know, your grounds in your filter like that, but there's only going to be one point from where the water comes out. Usually it's like this little nozzle that just kind of goes like this over the filter, and it just comes out of that one central point. And it just kind of, if you guys have poured, you know, water into, or as you poured it into the grounds, you'll notice that the water is just trying to find ways out, right? So it starts creating this hole of its own naturally, right? So when you only have one point from where the water is coming out, the grounds on the outsides don't get leveraged as much, or they don't get used within the filtration process as much. Whereas with this, we really have full control to try to use all of the grounds as evenly as we can. So that's what really just increases the quality of this cup, which is so cool. And because it filters through so quickly, only the freshest, most readily available flavor compounds are what are filtering through. So really it allows for just a much more fresher tasting cup too. So that's kind of the purpose behind that. But you'll notice now, with the first round of pouring, the grounds kind of all got stuck around the outside. Okay. So with the second round of pouring, we're actually going to do the opposite of what we did the first time. Okay. We're going to go around the outside. And then as soon as we do one lap around the outside, you'll kind of see the grounds start to come back into the middle as soon as you hit them. As soon as you do that one lap around the outside, bring the water back to center, and then let it fill up until it hits this top silver rim again. And then we'll let it filter through. So I'll do it in a way that you guys can see it. Kind of just like make this a game. Like, I try to be as accurate as I can and get all those grounds off the outside edges. Just like that. And as soon as I do that one lap, I bring the water back to center. Keep filling it up until it hits this top silver rim. And we let it filter through. And you'll notice that the color is a little bit of like a more lighter brown. And that's just because it's filtering through much quicker. It's not really sitting there and marinating for a long period of time, which usually, with, depending on the brewing method, and with a lot of coffees that you guys probably consume on a day-to-day basis, that you'll see that the color is a little bit darker typically. Because this is filtering through much quicker, that's what's leading to a more of a lighter color. But it is just taking the freshest compounds there available to your cup. So it does, you might think it might look like diluted, for lack of a better word, but it really isn't, because it's, you'll notice it when you taste it. You just get hit with all of this flavor, and it's more like, you notice more clarity in the flavors when it filters through much quicker, because it's not sitting and marinating. All those flavors aren't like, you know, just totally on top of each other. They're a little bit separated. And you won't really understand until you really take that sip and notice, like, oh, wow, I noticed that little citrusy note there. And then once it cools off, you'll notice the little floral notes. So it's much more easy to identify certain flavors using a Chemex. So that's why it tends to be more of a preferred brewing method within the coffee community. But
Conrad, yes. Quick question, first question for you. Relative to the water passing through the Chemex and everything there, how do the different types of grinds or those type of settings, finer or coarser, impact that as well? Or is there anything to keep in mind for a pour over that we should be thinking about or leaning towards?
Yeah, great question. So as the coffee just cools off here, this is great timing for a question. So there's 4 different types of grind sizes. Now you want to stick to a particular type of grind size depending on the brewing method that you choose to use, right? Because it does make an impact based on the brewing method that you're using. So for what we're doing here, using the Chemex, what's called a medium fine grind is best for this. So that just kind of means it's not quite chunky, but it's not quite like a dust or a powder. All right, so I'll go through the 4 to kind of paint a picture of what those grind sizes look like, because you guys might have like some coffee bean grinders and it'll have like a scale from like 1 to 10 or like 1 to 15. It really varies per brand, so there isn't like a universal number. It's really just more of like a visual thing that you can see, and you can notice it based on these 4 different types. So the first is coarse grind, right? So coarse grind, coarse just really means chunky, right? And that's best used for a cold brew or when making a cold brew. Reason being that the longer that the grounds are required to marinate for, the more coarse or the more chunky you want them to be. So because this is coming through a little bit quickly, and it's not just sitting there and marinating, we need it to be more fine. So that a lot of the flavors can come through and it can still make a quality cup. If we put coarse grind into this, you'd get a much lighter cup because the water wouldn't have an opportunity to marinate into those beans and to let out that flavored coffee, I guess, at the end of the day. So yeah, that's the first one, coarse grind. Coarse just means chunky. Second is extra coarse grind. Okay, so extra coarse grind is just pure chunk, right? It's big pieces. So these 2 rotate between, in terms of the best method to use it for. It's either going to be cold brews or a French press. If you notice with a French press, the grounds marinate there for anywhere between 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how you're making it. Whereas a cold brew could be anywhere between 9 to 72 hours, depending on the flavor profile you're trying to achieve. So typically you would use extra coarse grind because it's the most chunky when making a cold brew. Coarse grind when using a French press because it's just lesser in time. The next would be medium fine grind. So that's what we have here. That's what's in these bags, right? So if you take a look inside, it's not quite like I can just get some on the spoon here. It's not quite like a dust or a powder, right? There's still some chunks in there, right? It doesn't look like it would be fully soluble, if that gives you like a visual idea. So that's what medium fine grind would be. That's what is best for what we're using here, the Chemex. And then last is fine grind, which is pretty much like a dust, like a powder. And that's what's best used for an espresso, right? Because that's when the water's filtering through the quickest. So it needs to pick up as many flavors as it possibly can in order to, get in that cup as quickly as it can. So to kind of summarize high level, the longer that the brewing method requires the grounds to marinate for, the more chunky or coarse that you want the grounds to be. The shorter that the brewing method requires the grounds to marinate for, the more fine you want the grounds to be. So the in-between is what you judge based on the brewing method that you're using. So hope that kind of gives you a good, well-rounded idea. But yeah, now that the coffee's cooled off a little bit, we can go ahead and start to sip it here. So if you guys could, grab one of your mugs, take the filter that you have and just put it over top. Should fit just like that over most of the mugs. We're going to place this off to the side, and then we're going to grab our other mug. Okay, and that's where we're going to pour the coffee into. All right. And don't be too quick to sip it. It is going to be pretty hot. I mean, my insurance is good, but I don't think I can get everyone covered here on the call. All right, so as that's cooling off, up to your comfort level, as soon as you feel comfortable, go ahead and take the sip and notice the acidity that you're hit with right away, as well as the fruity notes that'll come in. But as it's cooling off for most of us, figured I'd also touch on this other part of coffee that oftentimes gets missed, which is the aspect that it travels with us everywhere we go, right? It's such a big part of our day-to-day, right? It's like the first thing that we do in the morning is have a cup of coffee. When we go to a meeting, we have a cup of coffee. Towards the end of the day, sometimes people are just, kind of relax, get your thoughts together, kind of conclude the day. Sometimes people have a cup also, although it might not be as recommended to try to sleep, but everyone's a little different in terms of how they can handle it. We'll touch on caffeine in a little bit, but what I'm getting to is the communal aspect of coffee, how cool it is. And especially when we travel, oftentimes people have these mug collections and stuff. This is my Ferrari mug. It's when I went to the factory in Modena, in Italy. Such a cool experience. I got to see, the cars that were in the movies. I got to do the F1 simulator. But Modena was known for a few different things. Like they're also known for their balsamic vinegar. They're also known for their Lambrusco wine, which is kind of like a sparkling red, kind of like the red version of Prosecco. So many cool things there, and a lot of memories that I get to relive just through drinking through this mug whenever I see this, whenever I see this Ferrari logo. And I swear there's something about drinking coffee in a Ferrari mug that just kind of increases the caffeine. But yeah, just a mug that reminds me of some good times there. And while it's still cooling off here, the other mug, I recently went to Greece. And I got this one from Athens, and it kind of highlighted all the different places that I went to. Also went to Mykonos and Paros, a couple other islands, but it's one of those things where, we're drinking coffee every day. Why not start the day being reminded of some cool memories that we had, right? At least that's my perspective. So I am one of those mug collectors, definitely. But yeah, now that looks like, yeah, my cup is, I think it's ready to take a sip. So I'm going to go ahead and try that here. Yeah, it's like, boom, punch in the face with this acidity and fruitiness. I'm sure that you guys can notice it. So if we look at the flavors here again, floral, cane sugar, and bright citrus. Yeah, and as the coffee starts to cool off a little bit, there'll be a rotation of the flavors that start to dominate with that initial sip. Kind of interesting. So as you guys are sipping through this coffee and enjoying it, one cool thing, or another cool thing about the Chemex, or sorry, it looks like we might have a question. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
There we go. Hey, Conrad. Yeah, we just got a question for you.
Yeah.
What do you think the pros and cons of mug warmers are that keep the coffee hot for a longer length of time? Does that affect the flavor at all?
No, I don't think it does. I mean, if it rotates from hot to cold to hot to cold to hot to cold, then yeah, it probably would kind of dilute the flavor after a little bit. But if it just remains hot, I think it's totally fine. I think what might be the individual might be referencing is the Ember mugs. Those are pretty cool. I have one of those too. Great concept. Yeah, I wouldn't say it affects it too much. If anything, just keep it at the temperature that you enjoy, and then yeah, great innovation in my opinion. It doesn't really affect the flavor, no.
Is there a certain temperature that you enjoy? Do you know in Fahrenheit what the best temperature for tasting is?
That's a great question. I never pinpointed that. Just kind of let it cool off over time and keep pouring. And it would kind of restart the experience for me. I pour the next cup and it starts at a hot point, and then it just cools off as I sip it, and then I restart again. But yep. It's a great question. I'm not too sure. I feel like that would be more of like a personal preference in terms of temperature. Like my parents, they drink boiling hot coffee, whereas I'm like, okay, I need this thing to cool down a little bit.
Yeah, I'm always amazed at the people in Starbucks that order it extra hot, that they want it even hotter than it comes out normally. I don't know how they drink it.
Right. And especially when they give it to them, like even with those little like cardboard things, it's still hot. So I can't imagine even picking it up when they order it extra hot. Yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, so getting back into the other interesting part about the Chemex. So as to why the flavors might shift and rotate in terms of when you're sipping it, as it starts to cool off, the different flavors that take dominance in your flavor experience. So this might look similar to a contraption that's used in the wine world called a decanter. right? So for those that might not be familiar, I'm sure most people are on the call, but a decanter, basically, where you might have experienced it before. You go to a restaurant, you order a decent bottle of wine, and typically they'll let you taste it first, right? You swish it around, you act like you know what you're doing, you sip it, you accept it, right? I don't think I've ever seen anyone decline it yet, but you have that initial taste, right, from that sip. Then they pour it into a decanter, and they let it open up, as they say. Basically, they just let air go into it, right? Because it's been sitting in this bottle for X amount of years. More of a dramatic experience the older the bottle is. And it's crazy that the initial sip that you try to compare to the sip that you try after it's gone through the decanter, it could taste like a completely different bottle of wine. I don't know if you guys have experienced this before. Usually it's more dramatic the older the bottle is, but it's like this living thing. It's like, that is not the same thing that I just tried, right? So what am I getting at? It's similar to the experience with coffee. I will say it's not as dramatic as you get with wine, but it does act similarly in that once it cools off and it airs out in the decanter or in the Chemex, the flavor profile starts to shift a little bit. So I always found that fascinating, where it acts like this living thing pretty much, right? So it's like this mystery. It's like, oh, what is it going to change to, right? So that's another reason why people enjoy the Chemex. But a lot of similarities between wine and coffee. Coffee actually has 650 more flavor compounds than wine does. Again, I love wine, so I'm not talking bad about it, but just an interesting thing. There's more room for flavor manipulation with coffee than there is with wine. And to give you an example of that, if you so with actually, I don't think it would be with these current roasts that we have, but sometimes farmers will take a light roast bean, which tends to be, again, more fruity and acidic, but they'll add the dark roast flavoring to it, or the different flavor components of it, to a light roast bean. So you'll get the acidity of a light roast, but you get the flavors of a dark roast, which would put it, typically they'll toss it in the medium category of roast. So it's interesting to manipulate. So I mean, for the most part, fruity and acidic is going to be your light roasts. Chocolatey, nutty, cinnamony is going to be your dark roasts. But sometimes they intertwine, so you will see that from time to time. Now, how to distinguish that difference? There is a little hack. So usually, if you're going in the store and you're making your coffee purchasing decisions, oftentimes you'll see a lot of countries listed on the backs, just like you see here, but they're just not going to be as specific. Some brands do a really good job, and they'll mention all the flavors, etc., and all the details, but others just say Costa Rica, and that's all you got, right? The rest is left up to guessing, or Google searching really quick. But best way to look at that is, or to distinguish what to expect out of that bag, the higher the elevation of that country, typically the lighter the roast will be, right? So what does that mean? The more fruity and acidic it'll be, right? And which also has, I'll touch into caffeine in just a second, but yeah, so the higher the elevation of the country, if you don't know off the top of your head, no one's judging, just quick Google search. And yeah, the higher it'll be, the more fruity and acidic it'll be, right? The less of an elevation, the more dark roast it'll be. Sorry, it looks like we got another question here.
Yes. Question from our friend Mike. Does the ratio of water to grounds change with different roasts or grinds? I think as a follow-up to that, how does the ratio of water to the coffee grounds impact whether it's a pour over or maybe like the automatic drip that a lot of us use at home, things like that?
Yeah, so in terms of the roast, I wouldn't say so as much, but in terms of like how we just did it in the Chemex, there is kind of, it will depend on the device. So it's not a one size fits all. But with this, because we used 2 to 4 scoops of grounds, anything after about 2 rounds of pouring, like we could weigh it out and get very, specific. There are like ratios in terms of like 100 grams of water per scoop of coffee grounds. But with this, really, with 2 to 4 scoops, and you can kind of use this going forward, depending on the types of chemixes that you're using. Usually anything after 2 or 3 rounds of pouring, you're kind of just pouring water through. Like, it'll still pick up some color, but in terms of the flavor, you really got the most out of it, right? So there might be bigger chemixes where you might be making coffee for, you know, more people. So let's say you double that ratio, you make it 8, right? So then I would double the amount of pouring. So I would say between, at that point, 5 to 6, right? Or in this case, it was 2 to 3. That case, it can be, you know, 4, 5, 6, again, depending on how many scoops it'll need. But that's kind of how I would judge it. But yeah, in terms of the actual roast itself and the ratio, depending on the roast type, doesn't really impact it. So hope that answers your question there. So 2 to 3 pours with 2 to 4 scoops, tablespoons, I'll say. That's an easy way to memorize it. I realize not all the time people have a scale in their back pocket while they're making their coffee. So that's just a good kind of general rule of thumb to follow. So but yeah, so getting into the next cup. So if you guys could go ahead and start your water, and we'll let that get to a boiling point again. So we're actually going to jump over to the dark roast. I want you guys to really see a light and then just jump right into a dark and see what that's like. So go ahead and grab your Mexico bag and go ahead and to clean out your filter, just take it, tap it under the trash can a couple times, swish some water around it, and it'll be, you know, clean and good to go. Likewise, if you want to swish some water around your Chemex, pour it out, that would be great as well. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to do that. And while that's happening, I'm going to do the same thing we did before, is crack open your bag of Mexico, and same thing, anywhere between 2 to 4 scoops. Again, this is based on your caffeine tolerance level, which I'm sure a lot of people are eager to get on the topic of caffeine. It's one of my favorite topics as well within coffee, which we will touch on in just a second here. Yeah, immediately I'm noticing the flavor and the aroma difference as soon as I crack open this bag. But all right, so again, 2 to 4 scoops. Yeah, they don't have to be perfect. 1, 2. I'm gonna do 3.5. All right, cool. Close that bag. Now, same thing, grounds are kind of uneven, so tap it on the side. Make sure it's flat, just like that. Take your finger or the back of your tablespoon measure. We're going to create that little divot there again, up to the first crease of your index finger, just like that. And we'll let the water heat up and do its thing. So while that's doing its thing, let's get into caffeine, right? So we're gonna bust a myth real quick, because a lot of people think that dark roasts have the most caffeine, but they actually don't. So with light, medium, and dark roasts, another way to look at them is how much time they spend roasting in the oven. Okay, so light roasts spend the least amount of time roasting in the oven. Dark roasts spend the most amount of time. Okay, because dark roasts spend the most amount of time, more of that caffeine content is essentially burnt off. Okay, it does taste like a dark roast does taste like a stronger, more bold cup of coffee. I think that's where this perception was that's where it came from. So I totally understand that part, but yeah, it's actually light roasts that have the most caffeine. Now, there's a couple impacts to caffeine, or a couple in addition to the roast type itself. So light roasts have the most, but it's also the brewing method that you choose to use, right? So it's similar to the grind size that we touched on earlier, where the longer the grounds are required to marinate for with the brewing method that you're using, the more caffeine will be absorbed. Okay, so I'll say that again. The longer that the grounds are required to marinate for, the more caffeine will be absorbed. All right. So you guys remember with the breakdown that I gave of the different grind sizes, first there was extra coarse grind, which was best for cold brews. Second was coarse grind, best for French press. Third was medium fine grind, best for Chemex, what we're using here. And then last was fine grind, best for an espresso, right? So if you guys have ever had that nitro cold brew from Starbucks, and you've finished it and you realized like smoke was coming out of your pen when you were doing your assignments, or you were jumping around the walls like a pinball machine, that's why. It's because the grounds were marinating for the longest period of time when making the cold brew, so the most caffeine was absorbed. So this oftentimes throws people off because they think espresso should have the most caffeine, which per volume it does. It definitely does. However, if you were to fill a mug with espresso shots, that takes the lead by far. Don't do that. It's not recommended. All right. So yeah, you usually hear like people say extra shot, right? But if you were to like an extra shot in their drink, right, to give it a little bit more strength. But if you were to fill a mug, that's probably like this size mug, anywhere between like 7 to 8 espresso shots, which you're gonna be feeling pretty good. I'll put it that way. So yeah, definitely don't do that. But yeah, so with caffeine, light roasts have the most caffeine, or have the most caffeine, and the brewing method. So if you really want to go crazy, you can make a cold brew with a light roast. Now, no one's really doing this. You can take it and run with it. But yeah, typically you'll see cold brews made with a darker roast because it kind of makes up on the caffeine from losing it on the roast itself from how long it's marinating with the grounds. Obviously still has a good amount, but that's typically that's the scale. So proceed with caution as you guys do this. But yeah, with the ones that we're making here, because it's going through so quickly, it's not marinating as long, we don't get as much of the caffeine, transparently. We do get more of a flavor experience, but obviously we're having multiple cups here today, so we're going to be totally fine. And likewise, we started with a light roast, so that caffeine content kind of overrides the fact that we might not be getting as much through the actual brewing process, to where you're not really missing out on caffeine if that's what you're worried about. Now, the average cup, I'm sure this is a question for a lot of people, or at least a lot of people ask this. The average cup has about 100 milligrams of caffeine. Typically, and it's going to vary from person to person. It's not a one size fits all, but typically anything after 400 milligrams, that's where you're starting to impact your potential sleep later in the day, especially at the different times that you're consuming it, right? So coffee has a long, they call half-life of 6 hours. So it actually lasts for an additional time after that, right? So usually what I would recommend in terms of like how you can consume it, still enjoy it and feel fine and not impact your sleep later in the day, even though you might feel tired and you might be yawning, the quality of your sleep, I'm sure some of you guys have those fitness and health tracking devices like the Whoop or the Oura Ring that talk about your REM sleep, right? You might notice that if you're consuming coffee after, say, 12 p.m., even like 11 a.m., depending on what time you go to bed, your REM sleep could be impacted. Even though you might actually be asleep, the quality of your actual sleep will still be impacted, regardless of how you might actually feel. There's other stuff going on in our body, right? So it's really interesting to like compare the two and like play with it. Like, oh, I consumed coffee at this time, my sleep was better towards the end of the day. Of course, there's other influences, like if you've exercised and things like that, but just something to keep in mind. I would typically cut it off around noon, and then I would cap it at 400 milligrams. That's like the average suggestion. Of course, there's bigger people. I'm 6'3". I could probably take a little bit more. There's shorter people that just overall smaller people that, it's 1 cup of coffee and they're buzzing for the whole day. So it's really, you could base it off the volume. It's a trial and error type of thing, but that's typically what's suggested. So 400 milligrams, that's going to be about 4 cups roughly, right? And to give you perspective, a Monster energy drink, I think it's like a 16-ounce can, has about 160 milligrams of caffeine. A Red Bull only has but depending on this, I want to say the same size, it has 120, but it has a load of sugar. So that sugar kind of gets your energy higher too. So, you start doing the math, right? 400 milligrams, that's what, 2.5 monsters. And you start to think, if you actually had those energy drinks, what you'd be feeling like. So just some perspective so that you guys can proceed with a little caution as you consume your caffeine. I get it. The drink tastes really good. It does, but we got to be conscious of our recovery for the next day, right? All right, so it looks like my water's ready. We are ready to start the dark roast here. So got my grounds in there, got my little divot in there that I created. So same thing as we did last time. I'm gonna pour it in that little hole. And then as soon as that water creeps out, doing some laps around the outsides, a little ring around the rosy, till the coffee hits the water hits the top silver rim. We let it filter through. I do still have some left over from the first roast, so I'll go ahead and sip that. And as I am, while on the topic of health, a lot of antioxidants in coffee, quite a bit. It's very rich. It's actually one of the more rich things that we can consume with antioxidants, actually more than blueberries. We always hear blueberries, right? That they have all these antioxidants. Coffee actually has more, right? So, I mean, pair the two and you're on a different level, right? Some of the antioxidants that are in here is like, magnesium, vitamin B2, B3, B5. And you think about these vitamins, then you also see what's in that's really what's in a 5-hour energy is those B vitamins. So yeah, quite a bit of antioxidants, also a lot of very rich in polyphenols, specifically chlorogenic acid, which has a lot of health, preventative, disease preventative properties, which is really cool, right? So oftentimes we'll hear the negative sides of coffee where it keeps you, usually it's caffeine oriented, where it can keep you up too long because people just maybe aren't consuming it responsibly. But the good outweighs the bad, especially when consciously consuming it in the way that I've described. So a lot of great things when it comes to coffee. And actually, in some of the longest living people, it was on average a cup a day that they had. We also hear this with wine, but so I don't know what to believe, but kind of want to believe both, right? A cup of wine or a glass of wine and a cup of coffee a day, not too bad of a lifestyle. But all right, so I'm going to do my second round of pouring here. So again, we're going to go a lap around the outside this time first, and then bring the water back to center till it hits that top silver rim, and then we let it filter through. All right. Awesome. So another question that I typically get is, what's the deal with, additives or things to add into coffee? Is it coming from a coffee person, is it illegal to add something to your coffee? No, definitely not illegal. How I see it is you're drinking this beverage for the most part every day. So do what you got to do to make it taste good, right? That could be increasing the quality of your coffee, where you'll get more of a fresh tasting cup, probably what you're experiencing today. Or if you're settling for Folgers and things like that, where the beans oftentimes are a little bit burnt, still good. Coffee's good. I wouldn't say all coffee is created equal, but if you're consuming it every day, do whatever you got to do to make it taste good. If that's adding your favorite creamer, do that. If you're getting it at a gas station, you probably got to put in a good amount of stuff to make it taste good. If that's Jameson in some of your guys' cases, do your thing. Most coffee mugs are dark and covered with color, not like a wine glass. So you can probably get away with some of those things. Not recommended, but a little wink there. But yeah, so how I do it is I try to pair whatever I'm adding to the coffee with the flavor elements that are in it. Okay. So with light roasts, it's a little bit hard to pair, right? A lot of fruity elements, right? If we look at our Ethiopia bag, bright citrus, There's not like a citrus creamer, at least one that I haven't come across yet. What I will come across sometimes is like a coconut creamer, right? And a coconut flavor element in the coffee, or something that pairs well with coconut, right? So that's how I typically try to do it. Otherwise, if I add like a hazelnut creamer to a light roast that's more fruity, it'll kind of just kill the flavor experience in my taste preference. So I try to typically drink light roast as they are, just black, because it's easier for me to identify those flavors, and it's just kind of like a game. It's like an experience. I'm sipping it and I'm, trying to spot the different flavors, right? Dark roasts, totally different, right? If we look at our dark roast back here, we got on the Mexico, we got hazelnut, brown sugar, and milk chocolate. Those are all potential things to add into our coffee, right? Hazelnut creamers. Adding a hazelnut creamer to this Mexico roast will just take that hazelnut flavor experience. It'll just emphasize and take it to another level. So that's kind of how I like to do it, right? It's just to pair what I'm adding in terms of flavor with what flavors already exist in there, to kind of just give it a little spark, right? Just kind of, light it a little bit. So that's typically how I like to do it.
Awesome. Thanks, Conrad. And we had another question from our friend Todd. He was wondering about the different types of coffee beans, and just their impact. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So really the main types of coffee beans just depend on the roast, or how you're roasting it. Like we hear about green coffee beans, right? Green is just, it's at its like purest form. So coffee, actually, if you were to walk by a coffee plant, most people probably wouldn't recognize it. It's actually a pit of a fruit that's surrounding it. So there's a coffee fruit. It kind of looks like a cranberry, like a cherry. And so typically the green ones have not been roasted yet, right? And as we mentioned before with caffeine, those will have the most caffeine content in them, right? But as soon as we start roasting, that's when it starts to fade away. That's why the dark roasts don't have as much of the caffeine. So that's really the difference there, is at what stage is it in the processing process, right? Has it been roasted yet? Has it not been? When it's green, it has not been. When it's very dark, it has been. And then there's some little in between, like a light brown, a little bit darker of a brown, and then like, much darker. And then there's extra dark roast, right? So that's really the difference between the ones. Now, the coffee beans do get processed in different ways. So actually, if you look at your bag here, let's look at the, you can pick up any of them. So the Mexico bag, we see process washed, okay? So what does that mean? So in our case here, all of these are process washed. There will also be a process natural that's listed, but basically what this is if you've ever seen those Ocean Spray cranberry commercials, I don't know if you guys remember those, but basically it would be like this. It was like this cranberry juice, and this farmer would be like, the farmer looking guy would be in this like I don't know, like pond full of these cranberries, kind of just like wafting through them on a much lesser scale and not as dramatic. That's kind of what the wash process looks like. We take the coffee beans with the fruit, and we let them soak in and ferment under the sun after being, I guess you wouldn't say cured, but washed with water and soaked with water. So a lot of those flavors end up absorbing into themselves through the water, and you're cleaning it and such. Process natural is just taking the water out of the equation, where the beans and the fruit are there under the natural sun. So a lot of times in the natural process, it'll be more intense flavors, because the fruit that's around the bean will kind of like get really like on top of it, and the flavors will absorb quite significantly, because it's like drying like a raisin. So all those flavors, where do they go? They only have inside to go into the bean, right? So that's really the difference between the two there: washed versus natural. Okay. And then the different types of beans: green versus a roasted one.
What about like Arabica or Robusta beans? Some of the differences and on that side of things.
You know what? It really varies. Like there's a lot of these labels in terms of like the types of beans in that sense. It's kind of like I wouldn't say it's as similar to like wine with the different grapes of how they're made and the different flavors that they produce, because really a lot of it has to do with the elevation for coffee. That's what really affects the flavor. But yeah, I would say that there's not like a set way to distinguish between the two in terms of the actual dramatic impact that they have on the coffee itself and the flavor itself, unless it's in terms of the elevation that's being compared to it as well. So yeah, they're mainly just labels for location where they've come from. So it's just really just another identifier, which can give you clues as to what flavors to expect, again, based on the country that it's coming from. So hope that answers your question there. But yeah, my dark roast has filtered through, so I'm going to go ahead and pour that. So same thing that we did before. Take your filter, put it over top one of your available mugs, place that off to the side. Go ahead and grab your other available mug. In my case, it's my Athens one here, and pour the coffee through. So actually what we're getting here, what we're pouring through, it's not going to be exact every time. It's going to be between 150 to 200 milliliters. You can kind of see the measurements here, with 2 to 3 rounds of pouring. That's actually what's an industry standard size cup, right? So we look at a cup of coffee and we expect the whole thing to be full. And then we go out and we, purchase coffee and we're like, yeah, we'll get the small size. But based on like an industry measurement, and then you also take caffeine into effect and like calories and things like that, we're actually consuming probably double of what we expect, or double of what the numbers that we're looking at. So it's like a serving size type of thing, right? So if you look at a typical cup of coffee, an industry standard cup size is about right there with the 150 to 200 milliliters, whereas cup has double that. So it's kind of interesting, kind of like, you go to a bar and you're ordering shots and you're like, what is this flimsy little thing that they're giving you? The ones I have at home are like this. Similar thing there. But once again, yeah, don't be too quick to sip on the coffee. It is going to be hot, but as soon as you're comfortable, go ahead and give it a shot. You'll notice that there's much less of an acidity effect with this. You might still have some lingering acidic tastes in your mouth from the first cup of coffee. So if you want to switch some water around, you can do that to kind of take that away. But yeah, with this dark roast, you'll notice there's much less acidity and much more of like a chocolatey presence. Yeah, like it's really interesting. At least for me, immediately I noticed the milk chocolate and the brown sugar. The hazelnut hasn't come through yet. Maybe like once it starts to cool off, it'll start to take a little bit more dominance, but at this point it hasn't yet. Yeah, so if other things when looking at the bag, we talked about process, whether it's natural, wash, the different types of roast type, right? But if we look at the bag, a lot of cool detail here, a lot of cool things that we can learn. With this bag, this brand overall, they include the farmer's name on it, which is kind of cool. So one of the cool things that we do with them is when we send coffees out to these different classes, people are all over the place, right? So a lot of times international too. So you guys know that for airlines, they'll usually show like the paths, that like all those lines on a map of where they go. We send those to the farmers too, and they're always really happy to see like, wow, their coffee's traveling all these different places. It's kind of a cool experience for them. But yeah, in terms of how this brand specifically, if you guys are curious how they choose these farmers to get their coffee from, usually they're ones where they're in areas that they might not be paid as well. They kind of try to bring the little guy up to the top and give him some credit. And these are people that are heavily involved in their community, so it's kind of a cool story and path to follow. I don't think it's on these bags, but sometimes they usually have like their social links on here where you can follow and see how the farmers, in addition to the coffee that they're producing, how they're impacting their communities. And this brand helps those farmers with that. So there's a social impact side to it too, which is really cool. And it's actually how I got into coffee. If if you guys are curious. Not a typical, I guess, route to get into coffee, but I used to live in New York, and one of the fun things I loved to do was go to different cafes, and because there's so many different coffee shops there, right? And I wouldn't typically order, the same thing every time. I would go in and ask what they're known for. One time that would be a light roast, another time that'd be a dark roast. The next time that would be a Nutella Frappuccino, sprinkles and whipped cream latte, right? But after doing this for a while, for a couple of years, I realized like, wow, I've developed quite a palate for coffee, which is kind of what sparked this initial kind of passion of trying all these different ones. But while I was doing that, I was also, every time I went, I paid for the person behind me. And just a fun thing for me to do, especially in New York where it's very crowded. You never know who's getting behind you. Usually people are in a rush. So it's kind of like a fun thing for me to do, where I would just like completely like shock people in their tracks, and they'd realize like, I'd give them or I'd tell the person, yeah, I'll pay for the person behind me, whatever they're getting. They'd go to hand their card over, and the barista would be like, oh, that guy already covered you. And that moment of shock in their face was always so entertaining to me. And I'd have to be like smart about it, because sometimes they would think, I want something, or, what's the catch here, or whatever. But I would just be like, have a good day, take care. I'd turn around, I'd walk away, but then I'd turn back, and you would see that moment of realization for them, like, whoa, that was cool. And you'd be surprised with what a $3 cup of coffee can do to someone's day. It's pretty cool. Highly recommend it, especially in a drive-through, when you see it continuing to circle, and and even at a physical location where it starts a chain reaction. I started one that ended up going on for 2 hours before. So cool. So highly recommend. It honestly gives me more energy seeing those interactions than the caffeine in the coffee itself. But yeah, for the most part, that I know we didn't get to the medium roast, but I wanted to at least make sure that you guys tried the light and the dark and really saw the difference between the two. But you guys have plenty of coffee now to try out on your own. So hopefully that was a fun experience for you. But yeah, at this point, I realize we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to pass it back over to Jerry here, unless there's some additional questions that came through.
Thanks so much, Conrad. That was interesting and amazing. And you're absolutely right. Those random acts of kindness are so underrated and do so much for both parties. So thank you for sharing that with us. That was a great story at the end.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I also want to thank Kelly Casper, our amazing Vice President of Client Experience, for creating yet another great special event for all of us to enjoy. I know a lot of work goes into this, and thank you, Kelly. That was great. And a special thank you to all of our wonderful clients that joined us this morning. You are incredibly important to us, and we really value the trust that you have placed in us to reach your financial goals. We hope you are all feeling fueled up for the rest of your day, and can't wait to see some pictures of you with your I Love Financial Planning Fridays mugs. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing all of you again soon. Have a great day.